November 4th, 1943. Camp Hearne, Texas. The barracks door swung open to the sound of boots on wood. Johannes Kunz felt hands grip his shoulders, felt the cloth pressed against his mouth before he could scream. In the darkness, a kangaroo court had already decided his fate. He'd spoken against the Fuhrer. He'd told an American guard the war was lost. For this betrayal, 7 men now carried out their sentence. They beat him until his skull fractured, until the concrete floor beneath him pooled dark and wet. By morning, the 23-year-old soldier from the Afrika Korps was dead, murdered not by his captors, but by fellow prisoners who still believed in a 1,000-year Reich. And in that moment, American authorities realized they weren't just holding soldiers. They were holding a war within a war. Before you discover how America transformed enemies into friends through an unprecedented experiment, hit that like button, subscribe to WW2 Tailies, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. The problem began with arithmetic. By mid-1943, Britain had captured so many Axis soldiers in North Africa that prison camps from Scotland to Surrey had run out of space. More than 300,000 German and Italian prisoners needed somewhere to go. The Churchill government made an unusual request to Washington. Take them, house them, hold them until the war ends. President Roosevelt faced a dilemma wrapped inside a paradox. The Geneva Convention demanded humane treatment of prisoners. But Americans were dying overseas, their letters home describing brutal conditions in German stalags. How could the United States justify feeding and sheltering the enemy while mothers read telegrams beginning with "We regret to inform you"? The decision came down to cold pragmatry. If America treated German prisoners well, perhaps Germany would reciprocate. The logic was transactional. The humanity would come later. By 1944, more than 425,000 Axis prisoners had crossed the Atlantic. They arrived in Liberty ships that had carried American soldiers eastward, now returning with human cargo headed west. The military hastily constructed 700 camps across the United States, not along the coasts where sabotage might threaten war production, but deep in the American heartland, Oklahoma, Nebraska, Texas, Kansas, places where a man could see for 20 miles and escape meant walking into nothing but wheat fields and sky. Camp Alva sat in northern Oklahoma, population 5,000. Camp Hearne sprawled across Texas farmland outside a town of 3,000. Fort Robinson occupied Wyoming's high plains, surrounded by buttes and sagebrush. These weren't the bombed-out ruins of Europe. These were places where the war felt distant, where the horizon stretched unbroken, where German soldiers stepped off trains and looked around in confusion, wondering where the devastation was. Private Hans Wecker arrived at Fort Robinson in 1943. He'd grown up in a cold-water flat in Hamburg, sharing 3 rooms with 7 family members. The American barracks had electricity, running water, showers that worked. He later recalled the disbelief among his fellow prisoners. Our treatment was excellent. The food was better than anything we'd had in the Wehrmacht. Many complained about no girlfriends, no contact with family. But compared to the front, this was a golden cage. The camps themselves reflected American efficiency carried to absurd extremes. Each prisoner received a cot with a mattress. Mess halls served 3,000 calories daily more than American civilians were getting under rationing. Canteens sold beer, cigarettes, even ice cream. Recreation yards offered volleyball, soccer, chess sets. Libraries stocked German-language books. The Army provided lumber and tools for woodworking. Some camps had orchestras. Others organized theater productions of Goethe and Schiller. But abundance created its own problems. The Geneva Convention permitted putting prisoners to work, but not on tasks directly supporting the war effort. Meanwhile, American farms were hemorrhaging labor. Young men who'd once harvested wheat were now operating Sherman tanks in France. Sugar beet fields in Nebraska went unpicked. Canneries in Kansas shut down processing lines. Factory owners begged Washington for help. The solution came reluctantly. Farmers could contract for POW labor at 80 cents per day per prisoner. The government collected the money, paid the prisoners a small wage for canteen purchases, and kept the rest to offset camp costs. It was practical, it was legal, and it put thousands of enemy soldiers into American communities. Mel Lutyens was 9 years old when German prisoners started working his family's farm near Murdock, Nebraska. His father spoke fluent German. The family had immigrated a generation earlier. The prisoners arrived in trucks each morning, 10 or 11 strong men who stacked hay and harvested corn and built livestock fences. They played games with us, Lutyens remembered decades later, brought us candy and gum. At that age, you don't know enough to be afraid. Kelly Holthus watched prisoners work the sugar beet fields across from his family's farm in York, Nebraska. They stacked hay, did any chores. There was such a shortage of labor. Don Kerr delivered milk to a Kansas camp in 1943. He talked with the prisoners through the fence. "I thought they were very nice," he said. One prisoner told him directly, "I liked it here because no one was shooting at me." Keith Buss was a boy in Kansas when 4 prisoners arrived to help his father. A lot of them were stone masons, he recalled. They built us a concrete garage. No level, just nail and string to line the building up. It's still standing today. The work was meticulous. The craftsmanship impeccable. These weren't fanatics. They were men who knew trades, men who wanted to be useful. Men who were tired of war. But not all prisoners felt gratitude. In the compounds, a shadow war persisted. Die-hard Nazis maintained rigid discipline among the ranks. They organized kangaroo courts to punish those who showed weakness, who questioned Hitler, who cooperated too freely with Americans. At Camp Hearne in November 1943, they murdered Johannes Kunz for speaking against the Führer. 7 prisoners beat him to death in his barracks. American guards found his body at dawn, skull fractured, blood pooled beneath him. 5 prisoners were court-martialed. 2 were hanged at Fort Leavenworth. The rest received life sentences. The military responded by separating the zealots from the disaffected. Camp Alva in Oklahoma became America's hardcore POW camp, a Nazilager, as other German prisoners called it. The Army sent the troublemakers there, Afrika Korps veterans who still gave the Hitler salute, SS officers who enforced party discipline, true believers who'd rather die than admit defeat. The camp had 4 compounds ringed with double barbed wire fences, guard towers with searchlights, machine gun nests at each corner. It held some of the most ideologically committed Nazis in American custody. And yet even at Alva, something unexpected happened. The prisoners worked, they obeyed rules, they attended classes, because even true believers couldn't ignore what surrounded them, abundance beyond comprehension. German prisoners couldn't understand American logistics. The camps received weekly shipments of fresh meat, vegetables, bread, milk. Trucks arrived daily with supplies. Everything worked. Nothing broke down for lack of parts. The guards carried photographs of their families, talked openly about missing home. This informality shocked the Germans, accustomed to rigid military hierarchy. In the Wehrmacht, you didn't fraternize. You didn't show weakness. But American guards treated prisoners like men, not numbers. More confusing still was the waste. Prisoners watched Americans throw away food, that would have fed a German village for a week. They saw machinery abandoned because a single part broke machinery that could have been repaired in an afternoon. They witnessed a nation producing so much that waste didn't matter. For soldiers who'd fought in North Africa, where fuel shortages meant tanks sitting idle, where ammunition rationing meant infantry going into battle with half-loaded magazines, the revelation was staggering. In 1944, the United States produced 1.8 billion barrels of oil. Germany produced 33 million. For every barrel Germany refined, America produced 50. American factories built 96,000 aircraft that year. Germany built 40,000. The numbers weren't just superior, they were grotesque. They redefined what industrial power meant. Prisoners saw it in small details. The guards' uniforms never looked worn. Boots were replaced, not repaired. When mess hall equipment broke, new equipment appeared within days. One prisoner later wrote, "We realized we weren't fighting an army. We were fighting a machine that produced faster than we could destroy." By 1945, the military had developed an official re-education program. The Special Projects Division selected anti-Nazi prisoners and taught them democratic principles through literature, film, and discussion groups. Camp Concordia in Kansas became the first site where prisoners attended classes on American government, read newspapers without censorship, watched films showing concentration camp liberations. The program's goal was blunt: reshape German thinking before sending them home. Not everyone cooperated. Some prisoners refused to watch films. Others walked out of lectures. But many stayed. Many listened. They'd seen enough of war, enough of ideology that demanded everything and delivered nothing but rubble. When newsreels showed the liberation of Bergen-Belsen and Dachau, the skeletal prisoners, the mass graves, the mountains of shoes and eyeglasses, some German POWs wept. Others sat in stunned silence. A few still insisted it was Allied propaganda, but the evidence was overwhelming. The Third Reich had committed horrors beyond comprehension. In September 1945, as the war ended and camps began processing prisoners for repatriation, a German sergeant named Georg Gärtner escaped from Camp Deming in New Mexico. He vanished into America. For 40 years he lived under assumed names Dennis Wiles, most often working odd jobs, moving from town to town. The FBI hunted him. His photograph appeared on wanted posters. But Gärtner had fallen in love with America. He later said he didn't want to return to a devastated Germany. He wanted to stay in the country that had defeated him. He surrendered in 1985 on live television after 4 decades as a fugitive. Immigration officials granted him legal residency within days. He lived out his final years in America, the country he'd once fought against. Gärtner was unusual, but not unique. When the last prisoners boarded ships for Europe in 1946, they left behind relationships, friendships, even romances. Some had fallen in love with local women. Others had established connections with farmers who'd employed them. By law, they couldn't stay. The Geneva Convention required repatriation, but many promised to return. German estimates suggest that approximately 5,000 former POWs eventually immigrated to the United States. Some married American women and brought them back to Germany, only to return years later when economic conditions improved. Others wrote letters for years, maintaining connections forged during captivity. The Lutyens family in Nebraska exchanged letters with their former workers well into the 1950s, sending care packages to men struggling in a divided, occupied Germany. Years later, the families visited each other, former enemies sitting at the same table, sharing meals and memories. Only 2,222 prisoners, less than 1%, attempted escape during the entire war. Most were recaptured within days. Where would they go? How would they survive? The farms were vast, the towns suspicious, the distances impossible. More than that, many prisoners didn't want to escape. They had food, shelter, safety. The camps were boring, restrictive, humiliating in their way. But they weren't death sentences. After the war, when American POWs returned from German camps and described their treatment, the starvation rations, the brutal guards, the forced marches, the summary executions, the contrast became stark. German prisoners in America had been given what their own government refused to provide: basic humanity. Mel Luchens, the Nebraska farm boy who played with German prisoners in 1943, reflected on those experiences decades later. "When you know people as human beings up close," he said, "it really alters your view of people and the view of your own world." The German soldiers who worked his father's farm weren't monsters. They were young men who wanted the war to end. Men who missed their families. Men who could build a fence that lasted 70 years. The camps closed in 1946. The barracks were dismantled, the barbed wire rolled up, the guard towers torn down. By 1947, only a few hundred prisoners remained men, serving sentences for crimes committed in captivity, men waiting for appeals, men with nowhere else to go. The rest had returned to a Germany that barely resembled the country they'd left behind at war's end. It was a fractured homeland shaped by loss and exhaustion. The cities were rubble, the infrastructure destroyed, millions displaced, and the men who'd spent years in American captivity returned well-fed, healthy, some with college credits earned in camp classrooms, carrying experiences that sharply contrasted with the devastation awaiting them at home, and memories that refused to fade quickly afterward there. They told stories about America, about the abundance, the waste, the machinery, the kindness. Stories that sounded like fantasy to people living in ruins, but they were true. All of it was true, remembered vividly and repeated again and again by those returning home from distant camps abroad, then still. And those stories changed minds in ways no re-education program could have managed alone. When West Germany rebuilt and aligned with the Western powers, it wasn't just politics or economics that made the choice, or treaties signed under pressure after years of collapse and uncertainty and fear everywhere then felt. It was memory, the memory of men who'd been enemies and been treated as humans. Memory carried quietly through conversations, letters, and recollections, shaping attitudes long after barbed wire disappeared and the camps themselves faded from the physical landscape of Europe, struggling to redefine itself after war ended at last. In 2019, a German veteran named Hermann Blumhardt returned to Camp Aliceville in Alabama, where he'd been held as a prisoner. He was 94 years old, moving slowly, revisiting a place bound to memory rather than confinement after decades spent living an ordinary life far from battlefields and camps alike. He walked the grounds where the camp had stood, now overgrown fields with historical markers. He spoke to local historians about his time there, about working in the fields, about the guards who treated him fairly, and routines that replaced fear with stability during years defined by uncertainty and war. About the townspeople who were curious more than hostile. He said it was the best time of his life during the war years, the time when he stopped being a soldier and became simply a man again, defined by routine, work, and unexpected dignity within enemy territory, far away then. The lesson wasn't lost on him. It wasn't lost on the thousands of prisoners who experienced American captivity. They learned something the Nazi ideology couldn't accommodate, something that quietly undermined years of indoctrination through daily life rather than formal lectures, or forced confessions inside wire enclosures far from home then. that enemies could be humanized without being conquered, that strength didn't require cruelty, that a nation's power could be measured not just in tanks and planes, but in surplus bread and ice cream, and the choice to exceed minimum obligations toward captives during a global conflict defined by brutality elsewhere. They had been the enemy. They'd fought American soldiers, killed American boys, served a regime responsible for unprecedented evil. That history could not be erased, ignored, or excused by later kindness. Yet it existed alongside new experiences learned inside. Camps spread across the American heartland during wartime years abroad there. But in the camps scattered across Nebraska and Texas and Oklahoma and Kansas, they learned what it meant to be defeated by a nation that refused to match cruelty with cruelty, even when fear, anger, and loss made it tempting to do otherwise under total war conditions prevailing then globally. They learned that the opposite of total war wasn't total peace. It was humanity maintained even when it wasn't required, enforced not by treaties, but by everyday choices made by individuals within a vast system of guards. Administrators and townspeople observed by watchful prisoners learning again to trust slowly there. Those experiences lingered long after release, shaping post-war identities and political instincts. Memory more than propaganda carried influence forward, quietly reinforcing democratic alignment and cooperation during Reconstruction as nations searched for stability amid ruins left by years of bombing, occupation, displacement, and moral collapse across Europe, then still recovering slowly. The camps themselves vanished, but their influence endured through recollection. Humanity maintained when unnecessary became evidence that another future was possible, even after catastrophe, for people shaped by defeat. Captivity and unexpected mercy shone in ordinary gestures across barbed wire during extraordinary times of war and aftermath globally, then remembered. And when they went home, they carried that lesson with them into the ruins of the Third Reich, a seed planted in soil that would eventually grow into something different, something better, something that proved the truest victory isn't making enemies surrender. It's making enemies realize they were wrong